Hello, everyone. My name is Emily. I used to think life as the eldest daughter was a blend of privilege and responsibility. Growing up, I excelled at school, earned accolades for my achievements, and revealed the admiration of my family. My sister Emma and I were 2 years apart, and though we weren't inseparable, we shared a certain camaraderie. When Ruby came along, it felt like she belonged to a different generation altogether. I was already 12, busy navigating adolescence, and Ruby was just a baby who cried through the night and disrupted what I thought was a perfect family rhythm. Our parents doted on Ruby in the beginning, but as she grew, she seemed to fade into the background. Emma and I were the stars. Mom and Dad were always cheering us on. My straight A's, Emma's cheerleading trophies, while Ruby quietly observed from her corner, a shy, self-reliant little girl who didn't demand attention. By the time I hit high school, I was deep into the whirlwind of teenage milestones. I was the first in the family to bring a boyfriend home. I still remember the awkwardness of introducing him to Dad, who tried his best to be intimidating, but only managed a nervous handshake. Emma followed in my footsteps, bringing her own dates home soon after. Ruby, meanwhile, would hover quietly nearby, watching everything with wide eyes. At 16, I secured a spot at Northwestern, a momentous occasion that became a week-long family celebration. There were pancakes with whipped cream, a banner Mom hung across the living room, and an endless stream of calls to extended family announcing the news. Ruby sat in the background, silent but smiling, as if she didn't quite belong in the excitement. Looking back, I wonder if that was when she started to feel like she didn't matter as much. Emma got into college 2 years later, and soon after, both of us were out of the house. Ruby, then barely a teenager, was left in the echoing emptiness of our once lively home. I didn't think much about her back then. I was too busy navigating college life, relationships, and my future. Things took a sharp turn when I got married and had my first child, Mason. Becoming a mother was transformative, terrifying and exhilarating all at once. Mason was perfect, and I felt this overwhelming need to do everything right for him. Our parents were thrilled to be grandparents, and Ruby, now 15, seemed genuinely excited to have a nephew. "Ruby, you're going to be the best aunt," Mom said one evening, squeezing Ruby's shoulder as we admired Mason sleeping in his bassinet. Ruby smiled, her cheeks turning pink with pride. For a while, it felt like our family had come together again. Emma and I were raising kids, and Ruby, the dutiful younger sister, seemed eager to help. The first time I asked Ruby to babysit Mason, it was almost an afterthought. I needed to pick up some groceries and Mom was busy. Ruby, ever the quiet helper, nodded and took Mason's tiny hands in hers. "You're a lifesaver," I said, ruffling her hair like she was still a kid. But that first small favor set a precedent. It became all too easy to lean on Ruby. Grocery runs turned into coffee dates with friends, then spa days, and eventually full Saturdays to myself. Ruby never said no, though her expressions sometimes hinted at exhaustion. I brushed it off, convincing myself she was fine. After all, family helps family, right? When Emma had her first child, Lily, it was as if Ruby's role as the family babysitter was cemented. Between Mason and Lily, her weekends became a rotation of feeding bottles, changing diapers, and managing tantrums. I knew she had her own life. School, friends, even a boyfriend. But I didn't think twice about asking her to put those things on hold. "Jason asked me to the movies tonight," she said one evening, juggling Mason on her hip while Lily cried in her arms. "Well, maybe you should have thought about that before agreeing to babysit," Dad chimed in from the couch. Ruby's lips tightened, but she didn't argue. She never did. Looking back, I realized how often we used her willingness against her. By the time Ruby started her college applications, she seemed more distant. She still babysat when asked, but there was an edge to her tone, a quiet defiance that hadn't been there before. I tried to suggest a local college, something nearby so she could live at home, help with the kids, and save money, but she brushed me off. "I got into Berkeley," she announced one evening, her voice steady but her eyes daring anyone to challenge her. The family sat in stunned silence, save for Grandma Rose, who broke into a wide grin. "That's wonderful, Ruby. A perfect fit. But what about the community college here?" I offered weakly. "You could stay close and—" Grandma cut me off. "She deserves this opportunity. Let her go." That was the first time I felt a pang of resentment toward Ruby. I didn't understand why she was so eager to leave, why she seemed to look at us like we were holding her back. It didn't occur to me that maybe, just maybe, we were. When Ruby left for college, it felt like a shift in the family dynamic. The house seemed quieter, though not in the comforting way it used to be when Emma and I left for school. It was almost empty. For years, Ruby had been the silent glue holding things together, watching over our kids, stepping in to help without being asked. Now, without her around, everything felt off balance, but life kept moving. Mason was growing fast, and Luke was born soon after Ruby started her freshman year. My hands were full juggling two boys, but I still managed to check in on Ruby occasionally. My calls often went unanswered, though. "Busy with classes," she'd say whenever she finally called back. I didn't push. College life was hectic, I remembered that much. Emma was also adjusting to her new reality. With Sophie and Max now in her orbit, her life was a whirlwind of daycare pickups, meal prep, and bedtime battles. Like me, she had leaned on Ruby without thinking twice. Now we both felt the loss of that invisible support system. Holidays became our family's way of reuniting. Thanksgiving and Christmas were non-negotiable. Everyone was expected to be home. That first Christmas after Ruby left for Berkeley, I was excited to see her again. But when she walked through the door, something about her was different. She was more confident, self-assured in a way that caught me off guard. She hugged Mason and Luke, but there was a distance in her demeanor that I couldn't quite place. "Ruby," I said, passing Luke to her with a grin. "He's been asking for you all day." Luke had barely learned to say auntie, but I used the line anyway. Ruby's smile didn't reach her eyes as she took him, but I didn't think much of it at the time. The day was chaotic in the usual way. Kids running everywhere, adults chatting over wine, and Mom flitting between the kitchen and dining room like a conductor orchestrating a symphony. Ruby spent most of her time upstairs with the kids, keeping them entertained while the rest of us enjoyed a rare moment of peace. It was a dynamic that felt so natural, I didn't stop to consider how unfair it was. That evening, as we prepared to leave, I caught Ruby sitting quietly at the kitchen table, her expression a mix of exhaustion and resignation. "Thanks for watching the boys today," I said, adjusting Mason's jacket. "You're a lifesaver." She didn't respond right away. Instead, she looked at me with an expression I couldn't quite read, something between frustration and sadness. "You're welcome," she said finally, her tone so flat it felt like a warning. I ignored it. The next year passed in a blur of milestones and challenges. Luke turned 2, Mason started preschool, and Emma added another baby to her growing brood. Ruby was thriving at Berkeley, at least from what little we heard. Her visits home were infrequent, but when she did come back, she always seemed reluctant, as if stepping into our world was a chore she couldn't avoid. That Christmas, things reached a breaking point. I arrived at Mom and Dad's house with Mason and Luke in tow, already exhausted from the chaos of getting them dressed and out the door. Emma showed up shortly after, her 2 kids trailing behind her. The house was soon filled with the shrieks and giggles of children, and before long, the same routine began. "Ruby, the boys have been asking for you all day," I called out as I passed Luke to her. She hesitated, but I barely noticed, already turning my attention to a conversation with Mom. The hours ticked by, and Ruby stayed upstairs with the kids, just as she always did. It wasn't until after dinner, when the house began to quiet down, that I realized how much we had come to depend on her. I found her in the living room, sitting alone with a plate of leftover pie. "Long day?" I asked, sitting beside her. She didn't look up. You could say that. I wanted to thank her, to acknowledge how much she helped, but the words caught in my throat. Instead, I launched into plans for New Year's, asking if she'd be available to babysit again. Her silence was deafening. By the time she left for Berkeley again, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted. Ruby had always been quiet, but now her silence felt pointed, like she was holding back something she wanted to say. Months passed, and life returned to its usual rhythm. Emma and I managed our growing families, relying on each other more now that Ruby wasn't around. Still, I couldn't shake the nagging thought that we had taken her for granted. When the holidays rolled around again, Mom sent out her usual text coordinating Christmas plans. This year would be bigger than ever, she said. Sarah's sister-in-law, Lisa, would be joining us, along with her 3 kids. Between the cousins and our own brood, there would be 12 children in the house. It's going to be chaotic, I joked to Emma as we finalized plans. But at least Ruby will be there to help. Emma laughed, but there was an edge to it. If she doesn't move to a new planet first. On Christmas morning, the house was a madhouse. Kids were everywhere, spilling juice, fighting over toys, and screaming loud enough to shake the walls. I barely had a moment to think as I corralled Mason and Luke, trying to keep them from destroying the tree. Ruby arrived mid-morning, her smile tight but polite. I passed Mason to her almost immediately, falling back into the familiar routine. The boys have been dying to see you. She didn't protest, but there was something in her eyes, a flicker of defiance I hadn't seen before. I brushed it off, too busy wrangling Luke to pay attention. As the day wore on, I realized something was different. Ruby wasn't taking on as much as she usually did. When I asked her to watch the kids while I grabbed lunch, she hesitated, then shook her head. I think they can manage without me for a bit, she said, her tone even but firm. I didn't know what to say. Ruby had always been the one we relied on, the dependable little sister who stepped in without complaint. But this time, she was drawing a line, and for the first time, I started to wonder if we had pushed her too far. The shift in Ruby's behavior didn't go unnoticed by the rest of the family. As Christmas Day went on, I could feel the tension simmering beneath the surface. Ruby wasn't her usual self. Her willingness to help with the kids had started to fade, and it was as though she was trying to pull away from the family dynamics that had always leaned on her. But I didn't really understand why, at that point. After lunch, I tried to casually ask her about her semester, about Berkeley, but she wasn't engaging the way she usually did. Her responses were short and distant. It's good. Busy, but good, she said, her eyes darting toward the window as if she wanted to escape the moment. I kept pressing. You're coming home for New Year's, right? We're all going to get together and it'll be so much fun. She didn't answer right away. I could see her thinking, and I hated how long it took for her to respond. I'm not sure, she said finally. I think I might need some time to focus on school stuff. That was when I realized something had changed, something I wasn't prepared for. Ruby had always been the go-with-the-flow type, the one who didn't rock the boat. She was the one who showed up to all the family gatherings and lent a hand without a second thought. But now, there was something different in the air, something unspoken between us. I didn't know how to handle it, so I tried to push it out of my mind and move on. But later that evening, as everyone began heading out, I couldn't shake the feeling that Ruby was quietly making her exit from the role she had so long played in our family. I found her sitting on the stairs, her bag packed, looking like she was ready to leave before anyone even noticed. It felt like a punch to the gut. I wasn't ready for her to stop being the person who made everything easier, the one who never said no, who just quietly did everything for us. Ruby, I called out as I approached her. What's going on? Are you leaving already? She looked up, surprised to see me standing there, but her expression softened. I just need some space, Sarah, she said quietly. I can't keep doing this. My stomach churned at her words. What did she mean she couldn't keep doing this? It wasn't like she was being asked to do anything extreme. It was just babysitting. It wasn't a big deal, was it? Everyone had their part to play in the family. Wasn't this just what we did for each other? Ruby, we need you, I said, my voice thick with emotion. You're the one who makes it all work. The kids love you. Mom loves you. We all do. You can't just walk away from that. She looked at me with a sad smile. I've been doing it for years, Sarah. I've been the one who steps in whenever you need me, but no one ever asked if I wanted to do it. No one ever asked if I had my own life. It's always been about what you need. The words hit me like a slap in the face. I hadn't realized, not fully, how much I had relied on Ruby, how much we all had, without ever thinking twice. But I wasn't ready to hear what she was saying. Not now. Not in the middle of Christmas. But your family, I protested, trying to keep the panic out of my voice. That's what family does. We help each other out. We sacrifice for each other. Ruby's expression hardened, a bitterness creeping into her tone. You don't get it, do you? I've spent my whole life sacrificing for everyone else. For you, for Mom, for all these kids. And when I finally want to do something for myself, when I finally want to say no, you act like I'm being selfish. I'm not asking for your approval. I'm just asking for the space to figure out who I am, outside of being the one who cleans up everyone's messes. Her words hit hard, harder than I wanted to admit. I had spent so much time focused on my own life, my own kids, and my own worries that I hadn't seen how badly Ruby had been drowning in it all. She had been the one carrying the weight of the family's expectations, and I hadn't even realized it. I opened my mouth to argue, to tell her that she was overreacting, that we all depended on her, but nothing came out. The truth of it stung too much. Instead, I just stood there, watching her pick up her bag and walk out the door. "I'll see you later, Sarah," Ruby said, not coldly, but with finality. "But it won't be like it was before. I can't keep doing this." As she left, I felt a wave of guilt wash over me, and for the first time, I wondered if I had been taking her for granted all these years. I didn't want to believe it, but deep down, I knew she was right. I had been so focused on my own life that I hadn't seen how much she had been quietly suffering under the weight of everyone's needs. That Christmas was a turning point, but I didn't realize it at the time. Ruby's absence left a void that none of us had prepared for. Mom, Dad, and even Emma didn't know what to do without her, but we all kept pretending like everything was fine. The truth, though, was that Ruby had finally stopped pretending. She had found her voice, and for the first time, I had to face the reality that I wasn't the only one who needed things. I wasn't the only one who mattered. It took me months to fully understand what had happened that day, but the shift was real. Ruby had done the unthinkable. She had walked away from the role she had played for so long, and now I had to deal with the aftermath. The silence that followed Ruby's departure that Christmas lingered like an uncomfortable weight on my chest. The house felt emptier, quieter, as if something important had been taken from us, and we weren't sure how to fill the space. We kept going through the motions, but without Ruby's presence, everything seemed off. I tried to convince myself that it was just a phase, that she'd come around eventually, but deep down, I knew something had changed. Ruby had always been the one to step in without asking for anything in return. She had been the rock, the unspoken glue that kept everything together, and now she was gone. Not physically, but emotionally. I could feel it in the way she spoke that day. It wasn't just a simple request for time away. It was a declaration that she was no longer willing to sacrifice herself for everyone else. For the next few months, I couldn't shake the feeling that Ruby was slipping further and further away. The messages she sent were few and far between, and whenever we did talk, she sounded more distant. There was a subtle change in her tone, a shift that made it clear she wasn't going to return to her old role. I tried to keep things normal, tried to reach out, but it was like talking to someone who was on the other side of a thick wall. Mom didn't know how to react either. She was frustrated, hurt, but mostly confused. She didn't understand why Ruby was suddenly pulling away from everything. "She's just being difficult," Mom would say, brushing it off as if it was just a temporary phase, a part of growing up that she'd get over. But I knew better. Ruby had always been the one to give. She'd given up her weekends, her time, her energy, all to help us. And now, she was taking it back. She was putting herself first, and I couldn't blame her for it. It was hard to admit, but I realized I had been taking her for granted. I had expected her to be there, to do what I needed, without ever considering how much she had been sacrificing to keep up with the endless demands of the family. It was difficult for me to wrap my head around it. I had always relied on Ruby, whether it was helping with the kids, running errands, or just being the one who was always there when I needed her. It had never occurred to me that maybe, just maybe, she needed something from us too. She needed our support, our understanding. She needed us to stop expecting so much from her, but I had never given her that. Instead, I had treated her as if she were the one constant in the ever-changing chaos of our family life. I'd never stopped to ask what she needed. I never saw that she was struggling too. Then came the email, the message that finally made me realize the full weight of everything Ruby had been feeling. She had sent a short, simple message to our family group chat. "I'm not coming home for Thanksgiving this year. I need time for myself. Please stop asking me to babysit. I'm done with it." That message stung. It was direct, it was final, and it left no room for negotiation. It felt like she was cutting the last thread that had tied her to all of us, to the role we had expected her to play. I didn't know what to do with it. I stared at the screen, rereading her words, my mind trying to process the reality of it. It was clear she wasn't coming back to the way things were. She had finally set a boundary, and I wasn't sure how to handle it. Part of me wanted to lash out, to tell her she was being unreasonable, to remind her of all the things we had done for her. But another part of me, the quieter part, knew that this was her way of saying that she was done being everyone's afterthought. She was done being the one who was always there, never asking for anything in return. I took a deep breath and called Mom. I needed to talk to her to figure out what had gone wrong and what we could do to fix it. Mom, I said when she picked up, Ruby's serious about this. She's really done with everything. There was a pause on the other end. I could hear Mom exhale slowly. I don't understand. She's always been there for us. She's always helped. Why would she suddenly stop? I don't know, I replied, but maybe we've all been taking her for granted. Maybe we've been asking too much. We've never given her a chance to just be herself. Mom was silent for a moment, processing what I had said. But she's family, Sarah. She's supposed to help. We all help each other out. That's just it, Mom. We've been using her, expecting her to drop everything for us, and we never stopped to ask if she was okay. We've always seen her as the one who doesn't need anything, but maybe we were wrong. The conversation didn't go much further after that. We both knew what needed to be done, but neither of us knew where to start. I knew Ruby wasn't going to forgive me just because I understood. I had to show her, not just with words, but with actions, that I was willing to change, that I was ready to put her needs before my own for once. But that was going to take time. I couldn't expect things to get better overnight. Ruby had made her decision, and I was going to have to respect that, no matter how hard it was. The first step was to give her the space she needed, to stop asking her to come back and do everything for us. That meant no more guilt-tripping her into helping with the kids, no more assuming that she would always be available when I needed her. I had to learn to do things for myself, to stand on my own 2 feet without relying on Ruby to hold everything together. It wasn't easy. The pull to ask her for help was always there, like an old habit I couldn't shake. But each time I caught myself, I reminded myself that this was Ruby's time. It was time for her to find her own way, to figure out who she was without the constant pressure of our family's needs weighing on her. And slowly, I began to see the changes in myself. I started taking responsibility for my own life, for my own kids, and for my own mistakes. It wasn't perfect, but I was learning. It was hard, but I could see a future where Ruby wasn't just the caretaker anymore. She was going to be something more, something I wasn't sure we had ever let her be, but I had hope, and that was more than I had a few months ago. It wasn't easy adjusting to the change. After Ruby left, I found myself at a crossroads. There were times when I missed her, when I regretted all the times I had asked for her help, assuming she would always be there. But at the same time, something inside me told me this was the wake-up call I needed. If we were going to be a real family again, I needed to change. I couldn't just expect Ruby to continue playing the role we had given her for so long. For the first few weeks, things were awkward. There was this tension hanging in the air every time we spoke to Ruby. Mom, Dad, and I would text her, hoping she would come home, hoping she would come back to us to play the part we had grown accustomed to. But each time, Ruby remained firm. She needed her space, and I knew that now. I understood it, but I hated it. It wasn't just about her leaving. It was about the reality that we had lost her trust. We had hurt her without even realizing it. I could still hear her words, "I'm done being everyone's unpaid babysitter." It stung because I knew she was right. All those years of asking for her help without considering her own needs had built up into this moment. At Christmas, when the usual chaos hit the house, I could feel her absence like a hole in my chest. The kids were still loud, still demanding, but it wasn't the same without Ruby's calm presence. Even when I tried to make things run smoothly, I could sense how wrong it all felt. She had been the one who brought some semblance of order to the madness, and now there was just silence. One morning, after a particularly tough night, I found myself sitting in the kitchen sipping my coffee when Mom came in. I could see it in her face. She was thinking the same thing I was. "Do you think she'll ever come back?" Mom asked, her voice quieter than usual. I hesitated. I wanted to say something hopeful, to reassure her, but the truth was, I didn't know. Ruby was hurt, and there was no quick fix for that. We had to give her the space she asked for. We had to let her find her own way. "I hope so," I said softly, "but we need to show her that we understand, that we're sorry." Mom nodded, her eyes filled with regret. "I should have seen it sooner. I should have listened. I didn't know what to say to that. I couldn't fix it for her. I couldn't undo the years of taking Ruby for granted. I could only focus on what I could control now, and that was making sure we didn't repeat the same mistakes. So, for the next few months, I tried to make changes. I started taking on more of the responsibilities I had pushed onto Ruby. I began to manage the kids myself, making sure I was there for them without expecting her to step in every time things got tough. I even hired a babysitter for those times when I needed help. I didn't want to rely on Ruby anymore. I wanted to be better for her and for the family. The biggest change came when we finally had a conversation with Ruby. It was a few months after Christmas, after she had had time to settle into her new life. I had been waiting for the right moment, but I was nervous. I didn't know what to expect. Ruby had been silent for so long, but now I felt it was time for us to show her that we respected her decision, that we were willing to change. When I called her, she answered, and I could hear the quietness in her voice. "Ruby?" I asked hesitantly. "It's me. I just wanted to talk." There was a pause before she spoke. "What is it, Sarah?" "I've been thinking a lot about everything," I said, my voice steady, "about what happened, and I realize now that I've been selfish. I've taken you for granted, and I'm sorry. We all are. You were always there for us, and I didn't see how much that cost you. I'm done being the family babysitter," she said quietly, as if it was a decision she had made long ago and was not going to change. "I get it," I replied, my voice sincere. "You're right. You shouldn't have had to play that role. We should have been more considerate. I should have been more considerate." There was a long silence before she spoke again, her tone soft. "I know you're trying, Sarah, but it's not just about being sorry, it's about showing it. I need to see that you can change, that you won't just expect me to be there anymore. I need my own life." "I understand," I said, "and I'm not asking you to come back right now. I just want you to know that I respect your space, and when you're ready, we'll be here. I'll be here." After that conversation, I let Ruby have her space. I didn't pressure her to come home for holidays or family gatherings. I stopped expecting her to be there for us, and I focused on being there for my own family. It was difficult at first, but it was necessary. Months passed, and Ruby started reaching out. Slowly, cautiously, she began to reconnect with us. But it was different now. She wasn't the same person who had always been the quiet helper in the background. She was her own person, and she wasn't afraid to stand up for herself anymore. I admired her for that. Then came the day when she visited. It wasn't a big event. It wasn't a grand gesture. It was just a simple visit. And for the first time in years, it felt like we were a real family again. There were no expectations, no hidden agendas. Just me, Ruby, and the rest of the family, sitting down for dinner like we hadn't in so long. It wasn't perfect, but it was a start. And that was all I could ask for. The weeks following that dinner felt like a slow rebuild. It was like standing on cracked ground, unsure if the foundation could hold. Every conversation with Ruby felt tentative, like we were learning how to talk again after years of miscommunication. But we kept going. We kept trying. It wasn't just about fixing what had happened, though. It was about creating a future where Ruby didn't have to be the scapegoat, the family's free labor. It was about showing her every single day that we understood the weight of our actions and that we were capable of change. I started noticing the little things, the way I didn't expect Ruby to watch the kids anymore, the way I took charge when I saw something that needed to be done. I noticed how much she appreciated the space to be herself without the constant demands from the family. She had her own life now, one that was completely her own, and we were no longer a part of it by default. And that was okay. That was healthy. For the first time, I realized just how much we had taken her for granted. I had assumed that Ruby would always be there, always ready to take the kids so I could have some time off. I thought it was normal, but it wasn't. It wasn't fair to her, and I had been blind to that for so long. Ruby's absence had created a vacuum, one that made me face the reality of what we had built, or rather, hadn't built. She had given up so much of her life for us, and in return, we hadn't even offered her the basic respect she deserved. And so, we kept moving forward, step by step. The family dynamic began to shift. Slowly, I started to take on more responsibility. I made sure to give Ruby the time and space she needed. And when we did interact, it was no longer with an unspoken assumption that she would take care of everything. I made it clear that I was doing my part, and I wasn't expecting her to do mine anymore. Eventually, Ruby began visiting more frequently. There were still some bumps along the way, moments when the old patterns tried to reemerge, but Ruby wasn't backing down, and neither was I. I knew now that we had to keep working, even when it was uncomfortable. One afternoon, after a particularly long conversation about where we wanted to go next, Ruby said something that made my heart catch. She wasn't just talking about the past anymore, she was talking about the future. She was talking about us. "I think we're finally getting it," she said, her voice calm but firm. "I'm not just the backup anymore. I don't have to be your go-to. I have my own life now, and you all need to respect that." I didn't know what to say at first. Part of me wanted to apologize, to beg for forgiveness for all the times I had taken her for granted. But I didn't. Instead, I just nodded. "I'm proud of you," I said quietly, "and I'm sorry." Ruby didn't respond immediately, but I could see something shift in her. Something light, like she was finally letting go of the anger and the hurt. It was like we were starting over, but this time, we had the right foundation. In the months that followed, things improved in ways I never thought possible. My relationship with Ruby slowly healed, not because we could undo the past, but because we were willing to change, to evolve, to let go of the roles we had each played for so long. Ruby was no longer the babysitter, the one who had to take care of everyone else. She was herself, and that made all the difference. I stopped expecting her to be the family's support system, and instead, I focused on being the kind of sister she deserved. A sister who would stand by her side, not just when it was convenient, but always. It wasn't perfect. We still had moments of tension, of misunderstandings. But now, when we spoke, I could hear the difference. We were two adults, learning how to be a family again, not a group of people trying to fit someone into a box they never belonged in. As I sat in my quiet room one evening, reflecting on everything that had changed, I realized something important. We hadn't just fixed the problem. We had grown. We had learned to respect each other, to acknowledge our flaws, and to find the strength to move forward together. And for the first time in a long while, I felt hopeful about what was ahead.